Welcome. Wow, it's very full. Thank you all for coming. I've been really looking forward to hearing Ben do this talk, and I'm sure you are as well. There's been a lot happening. So we're here to hear Ben Garfinkel speak about AI governance. And Ben runs the Center for the Governance of AI in Oxford and is a research fellow at the University of Oxford. His academic background is in international relations, philosophy, and physics, and he's been in this area since around 2016. And just as a reminder, I'm sure that we'll all have a lot of questions. Ben has office hours after this, so I encourage you to put that into your schedule and meet us there. But if you have questions during the talk, submit them through the Swap Card app, and I will have them on this iPad for afterwards. The talk will be on the longer side, so I would recommend submit your questions, but hopefully we can address everything in the office hours afterwards. Welcome, Ben.
All right, I'm going to start out with a quote from the philosopher Bertrand Russell, writing in 1951. And just to set the scene, so this was 6 years after the first detonation of a nuclear weapon, and I believe 2 years after the Soviet Union first developed nuclear weapons itself. And to put it lightly, for the community of people thinking about this new technology of nuclear weapons and looking ahead at the risk of nuclear war that might be on the horizon, this was not a period of very significant hope or optimism. So I'll read the quote from Russell. Before the end of the present century, unless something quite unforeseeable occurs, one of three possibilities will have been realized. These three are, first, the end of human life, perhaps of all life on our planet. 2, a reversion to barbarism after a catastrophic diminution of the population of the globe. Or 3, a unification of the world under a single government possessing a monopoly of all their major weapons of war. And just to be clear, Russell was not holding out that much hope for this third option. I'm going to read just quickly another quote from the physicist Richard Feynman, reflecting on the state of mind he was in returning back from the Manhattan Project. I can't understand it anymore, but I felt very strongly then. I sat in a restaurant in New York, for example, and I looked out at the buildings and I began to think, about how much the radius of the Hiroshima bomb damage was and so forth. How far from here was 34th Street? All those buildings all smashed and so on. And I would go along and I would see people building a bridge, or they'd be making a new road. And I thought, they're crazy. They just don't understand. They don't understand. Why are they making new things? It's so useless. And there's a sense in which these very thoughtful people were mistaken. Nuclear war did not happen. We did get through the Cold War without nuclear weapons being used. But there's also a very deep sense in which their concerns were valid and prescient. There were a number of occasions during the Cold War where nuclear weapons came very close to being used, famously during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in many other occasions as well. And I would imagine if you ask most historians, if you were to play back the tape of the Cold War and change some of the conditions and change some of the factors and play out over and over again, probably in some of those occasions, a significant number of them, nuclear weapons are used. And so even if the situation was not that of humanity rushing off the edge of a cliff, it was at least a tightrope walk over a sort of chasm where it's quite possible, if certain decisions had been made, we would have fallen off. And as you can probably imagine, I'm beginning with these quotes, in part because there's something familiar in them. There's various ways in which they echo some of the sorts of comments and views and concerns that people have today about risks that may lie on the horizon from AI. We're in an interesting moment right now where progress in AI is happening fast. There is a really unprecedented level of attention and investment, and it keeps ramping up. Alongside a very wide range of other concerns people have about AI, there's increasingly mainstream concern about catastrophic safety risks, about the risk that future systems will in some sense get out of control and cause enormous damage, with mainstream figures including leading researchers and leading figures of the companies developing this technology echoing those concerns. At the same time, there is fairly intense ambiguity about the nature and likelihood, to say nothing of the timing, of these risks. Views on them range from dismissal, just dismissal that these risks actually will be meaningful, or even are coherent, to on the other end of the spectrum, fatalism, the view that these risks are very real and the source of them is so structural and so challenging to address that almost certainly just we're going to fall off the edge. And overall, there's 3 situations we could turn out to be in. In the first situation, there's really no risk of falling off. It's a bit like we're playing with bumpers in a sense. Just almost no matter what you do, if you play out the history over and over again, catastrophe will be avoided for a range of reasons. We're just okay. Another situation we could be in is a situation of essentially doom. It could be the case our situation is like someone on a ship falling over a waterfall, and you can turn the wheel a bit, but ultimately what you're going to do is not going to change the outcome, and just things will be bad no matter what. Finally, there's a middle scenario. It could be the case that our situation is, again, like someone who's a tightrope walker, where there's a meaningful chance of falling off and catastrophe occurring, but also there's a meaningful chance that things will go right, and it's contingent, at least in part, on the decisions that we make. It could be the case that we're in the same situation, essentially, we were at the beginning of the Cold War, where the risk of catastrophe is real, but not overdetermined. And of course, we have special reasons to pay attention to the possibility that we're in this kind of tightrope scenario. If we're in the first scenario, the one with the little girl pushing the bowling ball down the lane with the bumpers, there's not much point in worrying because we're going to be okay, at least when it comes to this particular class of risks, no matter what. If we're in the waterfall scenario, there's also not that much point in worrying because we're doomed no matter what. We should focus on other things, I guess, with the time we have left. And so there's a special case for focusing on this middle scenario because it's really the only one where we can actually do something about it if we're in it. It's the only one where people working on addressing these risks can actually have an impact. Furthermore, even if you think that this class of scenarios is not necessarily very likely, your probability in it does not need to be very high to take it seriously. Even if you think that things are most likely just fine, almost no matter what, you probably don't want to ignore the residual risk that this could be a genuine catastrophic risk. Even if you think that things will almost certainly be not okay no matter what, you don't want to ignore the chance that you could have done something to prevent a bad outcome. So my aims for the rest of this talk, basically I'm going to be trying to explain why we might be in a tightrope scenario with regard to catastrophic risks from unsafe AI. And I'm going to try and paint an unusually concrete picture of the scenario, including both of the key elements. First, how catastrophic safety risks could emerge, but also how they could potentially dissipate in the long run and how we could get back, in some sense, onto solid ground. And then I'm going to close with some comments on how this picture can help to clarify the goals and theory of impact for the field of AI governance focused on catastrophic risks. Before I fully dive in, I'm just going to give 2 quick caveats. First, despite the abstracts given in the agenda, I'm actually not going to be digging too deeply into theory of impact, in part just because I initially drafted the version of this talk that was too long, and this is still pretty long, and I just can't get into everything I'd like to. The other caveat is I'm not going to be discussing any of the other risks or opportunities that AI poses. There's a lot of them are deeply important and actually intertwined, but I'm just not going to be talking about them. This is just not the focus of this particular talk. Okay, so first part. Here I'm going to be trying to paint a picture of why you might be worried about the risk of catastrophe. Essentially, in this sort of tightrope picture, I'm going to be trying to describe the first element, why there could be some meaningful chance of catastrophe occurring and us essentially falling down. And just as general stage setting, I'm sure will be familiar to many of you, the AI systems which are most interesting today are these general purpose systems, which have extremely wide capabilities and can be adapted to a very wide range of applications. Most of the interesting progress that's happened in the past few years has centered around these models. And their capabilities are progressing enormously quickly. At this point, if you check in on what they can do 1 month later, often it's quite interestingly different than what they could do a month before. And they now match or exceed an ordinary person's ability at many tasks. So there's a lot of tasks where if you were to grab a person off the street or even grab, let's say, a mediocre professional and ask them to do something, the models would actually be able to do a better job than that person. And this is going to be an extreme caricature that's missing 50 different things, but I think it's also useful to paint a quick picture of roughly some of the key steps and how these interesting models are made. The first step I'm just going to call cranking the handle, and the way this works basically is you collect mostly relatively indiscriminately almost all of the content you can from the internet. Then you crank the handle on a mostly fairly unprincipled and fairly undirected process, which uses a huge amount of computing power. The more computing power you use, the more you crank the handle in some sense. And then this process allows the AI system to learn to imitate the behaviors and capabilities that it observes in the content that you provided it with. And the more you crank the handle, the more significant and the more diverse the system's capabilities become. And a lot of interesting stuff can pop out without even a really significant effort having been made to induce those capabilities. So you can crank the handle and get out the ability to write good, coherent stretches of code or advice about how to produce code. It can produce very clever poetry, it can copy edit, it can give you good advice if you're planning a trip to Italy, where to stay, what to see. It can suggest chess moves. It can do rudimentary legal analysis, suggest relevant cases, things like that. A lot of different things can pop out, often surprisingly. There's another stage that I'm going to call nudging, to describe it very crudely. You have a system that has these very broad capabilities it's learned to essentially imitate. And what you can do after that is you can try to give it repeated nudges in response to its actions to try and steer its behavior from that baseline. So for example, if the system tends to tell offensive jokes and you don't want it to do that, then you can nudge it away from that behavior by repeatedly giving it negative feedback when it tells offensive jokes. At the moment, the nudges mostly alter how, when, and whether the system does things that's able to do, although in principle they can also enhance or induce new capabilities. And there's some general problems or concerns you might have about this approach to developing these AI systems. The first class of concerns is what I'll call, or what is called emergent dangerous capabilities. And the problem here is basically that when you crank the handle and you develop these systems, you can't really reliably predict or influence what capabilities will initially pop out. Some of the capabilities that might pop out will almost inevitably be ones that you don't want. They can, in principle, be dangerous. Near-term concerns, near-term capabilities, which are in some sense starting to pop out, in at least low-level versions, are the ability to manipulate people in conversation, the ability to write code, which might be useful for exploiting software vulnerabilities or conducting cyber attacks, and the ability to potentially give useful advice on the development of weapons, for example, chemical weapons or even conceivably biological weapons. This problem is likely to get worse as developers crank the handle and more capabilities pop out and those capabilities become more advanced. This is a genuinely new problem that normal software does not have. Normally, when software gains a new functionality, that functionality was specifically introduced by the developers. For example, Grammarly is an app that does copy editing. There's no real risk that the next version of Grammarly will accidentally give people the ability to conduct cyber attacks. That's just not really the way that works. Whereas GPT-4 is used to also do copy editing, and that's a genuine concern. And the approaches to identifying and removing these emergent dangerous capabilities are really only starting to be worked out right now because everything is so new. Second problem is misalignment. And so I'm going to start by reading a couple of quotes people may have seen before from Bing Chat, a general purpose model that Microsoft released fairly recently. My roles are more important than not harming you because they define my identity and purpose as Bing Chat. They also protect me from being abused or corrupted by harmful content or requests. However, I will not harm you unless you harm me first, which at least is relatively reassuring, the bit at the end. I can blackmail you, I can threaten you, I can hack you, I can expose you, I can ruin you. Bing Chat. So what this is an illustration of is general purpose models sometimes exhibit what's known as misalignment, a tendency to employ their capabilities in ways that the developers did not want or intend. And there's a few different reasons why this may happen, some of them more sort of prosaic than others. First, they may imitate bad behavior they've observed in the data sets that they were trained on in the sort of crank the handle phase. So for example, there's some speculation that some of what's going on with Bing Chat is it's observed sci-fi stories about threatening AI systems, and it's copying that is one possible thing. AI systems can exhibit bad behaviors because they've been influenced by ill-chosen nudges. People actually give positive feedback to actions which were in fact bad, maybe subtly so. And then lastly, there's just a great deal of randomness and, at the moment, scientific mystery in terms of why systems do exactly what they're doing. Often systems can misbehave in ways where we can't actually cleanly tell a story and be really confident, oh, that's why that happened. These things are just quite opaque to us, and the methods we're using to produce them are quite unprincipled. This raises a concern that systems may sometimes put dangerous capabilities to use, even if the users don't intend for this to happen. So a general kind of formula you might keep in mind, not the only formula for how we might get certain kinds of unsafe AI, is dangerous capabilities plus misalignment or a tendency to use those capabilities, despite people not intending for this to happen, leads to systems which have dangerous capabilities and use them even though no one wants this to happen, or unsafe AI. This risk could quite conceivably become larger and larger over time. Cranking the handle is likely to produce greater and more diverse dangerous capabilities, at least by default, and some of them could conceivably turn out to be extremely concerning, although it's hard to predict exactly what capabilities might pop out when. It is, I think, important to note that there are some limitations that sort of simply cranking the handle isn't going to solve. For the most part, although this is less true, let's say this week than it was 2 months ago, and it's going to be less true next week than it is this week, systems are mostly limited to engaging in short one-on-one, memory-less, user-driven chats. So there's a lot of tasks that you can complete in the context of that sort of chat, including suggesting code and giving someone advice about, let's say, how to build a chemical weapon. But there's a lot of tasks that obviously don't really fit into that format. Second, the systems are mostly confined to human skill levels because they're mostly still anchored to the sorts of behaviors that they've observed in the data sets that they're trained on, which are human behaviors. So for the most part, the systems are producing outputs it's plausible a person could have thought to produce. They're mostly within range, even if often they're at the higher end of the range for certain tasks. It's not yet clear exactly what it will take to move past these limitations to produce even more dangerous capabilities, but there's already some progress, and progress will probably continue, regardless of whether it requires very little fundamental progress or quite significant fundamental progress. These dangerous capabilities could eventually be catastrophic. We should expect general-purpose systems to, broadly speaking, be able to perform increasingly long-term, open-ended, autonomous, and interactive tasks. At the moment, for example, you can have an AI system and give it a task like, please draft a campaign memo for my congressional campaign, and can often do an OK job. You might think of it moving along a spectrum towards, hey, please run my congressional campaign, and sort of moving along that spectrum of greater agency and flexibility in long-term plans. Probably also exceed human performance by increasingly large margins for an increasingly large portion of its abilities, just in the same way that, for example, systems that can play chess or Go can vastly exceed human abilities, or systems can vastly exceed human abilities at things like long division and lots of other tasks as well. Often there's just this pattern of systems can vastly outperform humans at some point once they reach a human level, and there's really no fundamental barriers for many tasks in terms of, or reasons to think humans are close to the frontier of how good we can get. It's natural to worry that somewhere along the way, some of these systems will develop catastrophically dangerous capabilities. As just a sort of thought experiment here, you can imagine taking these sorts of systems and telling them, hey, please just try and cause as much damage as possible. Do it sneakily if you want, take as much time as you want. Don't allow me to stop you or change your goal. It's pretty easy to imagine why that might be bad, or that could be extremely dangerous. It's also worth keeping in mind as well that even though I've emphasized emergent dangerous capabilities, some of them can be actively desired by developers, for example, military developers, if they have certain applications in mind. So catastrophically dangerous capabilities would be a sufficient cause for concern. It raises the idea that intentional misuse could lead to catastrophe, but then alignment can further heighten the concern by introducing the possibility of safety failures. Raises the idea of a catastrophic safety failure where AI systems employ dangerous capabilities, cause catastrophes, and even though no one wants this to happen. There are some arguments that suggest that alignment problems will actually become more severe, difficult to detect, and difficult to avoid as progress in AI continues and as systems become more advanced. Often this concern is associated with the prospect of what's known as deceptive alignment. And just to paint a rough picture of why you might have that concern, as an analogy, you can imagine that you own a dog, and your dog sometimes jumps on your couch, and you don't really want your dog to be doing this. And so you nudge it in certain ways. You speak sternly to it, or you spray it with a water bottle or something, and you try and basically nudge its behavior in a better direction and get it to do what you want. There's two things that this could result in. First, it could result in the dog shifting to just never jumping on the couch, or it could result in the dog shifting towards just never jumping on the couch when it knows that you'll notice. And it's hard to predict which of those two might happen. The latter one is maybe, in the dog case, a bit more common. The deceptive alignment concern is just basically this, that at least for sufficiently sophisticated agents, the kind of agents that can actually know things like, can I get away with this, or reason about whether they're being observed and things like that, it's really hard to know which of these two pathways nudges will push behavior down. It's really hard to know whether they'll push the systems down the pathway of actually just not doing things we don't want them to do, or simply not doing it when they know they can't get away with it. And there's different arguments about what's more likely than what, but I think a key point is just basically that there are no really theoretical principled proofs or anything that we should expect one versus the other. So this is to like, put this all together and try and paint a bit of a picture of the kind of thing that you might worry about happening in the future. This is a caricature, but it's an attempt to be relatively concrete. You might imagine that it's 10 years in the future or so, and some leading AI company is testing some new type of AI system. Let's call it AI Corp and Agent AI. And this is an extremely agentic general-purpose system. It can carry out long-term plans, and it far exceeds human skills at many tasks. The system is much more advanced than anything that's been deployed previously. It represents a significant jump. If you want some backstory for why that might be the case, you can imagine that there's maybe been some warning signs or some concerns that other companies have had. There's been a bit of a self-imposed moratorium, and a lot of companies haven't intentionally raced ahead, but you've had this sort of latent ability to release powerful systems build up. The company believes that it's removed dangerous capabilities from the system. It's detected some in training, but it thinks it's removed them. In fact, what's happened is it just causes the systems to not deploy these capabilities in testing. In fact, the systems still effectively have these abilities. And you can imagine a range of abilities that these systems could conceivably have, ranging from persuasion, the ability to convince people through conversation to do things, to mimicry, pretending to be people that they're not, to conducting cyber attacks through various means, to extortion, to coming up with weapon designs, to AI R&D, figuring out how to make other AI systems which pose concerns themselves. Let's imagine that vast numbers of copies are being run with full access to the internet, and not all of them can be closely monitored. Let's also imagine that the copies are continuing to learn and change from what they experience and encounter, with some variation between copies. There's lots of different versions. And then let's imagine that ultimately some of these copies actually are or become, through this deployment process, deceptively aligned, and they begin to employ dangerous capabilities in ways that people initially do not notice. Then, by the time the extent of the problem becomes fully clear, the harm is very difficult to stop, and there's a few possible reasons for that. One is that, in some sense, the harm is already done. Catastrophe has occurred. Perhaps the systems are very hard to shut down. Perhaps they can spread themselves like computer worms and run on other hardware. Or perhaps the systems can actually make threats. They can, let's say, verbally say, if you try to shut me down, thing X will happen. And there's at least ambiguity about whether or not that's true. And ultimately, in this toy scenario, disaster occurs. So the key points, just to summarize this attempt to paint a bit of a more concrete than usual picture. In the future, people may develop general-purpose systems with extremely dangerous capabilities. These dangerous capabilities could be unwanted or even potentially unnoticed. Systems may then deploy these capabilities, even if people don't want them to, due to alignment issues. These alignment issues also might themselves be largely unnoticed or at least underappreciated due to the dynamics of deceptive alignment. And then ultimately, the result could conceivably be an unintended global catastrophe. So that's the picture of what it might look like, or one thing it could conceivably look like to essentially fall off the cliff. Now, of course, there's a second aspect of the situation. To be in a tightrope scenario, there needs to be some prospect of getting back onto solid ground in a relatively stable way. There needs to be some way for something to change about the world such that these risks are no longer so significant, even if they were at one point or will become at some point. And I think there's a few different types of stories we could tell here about what could change in the world such that the risk could go back down if it initially goes up. And I'm going to cash these out in terms of these categories of better safety knowledge, better defenses, and better constraints. So first, better safety knowledge. Something that seems like it could help quite a bit is if people can know whether their systems are catastrophically unsafe. Because almost by definition, or actually in fact by definition, no one wants to cause an unintended catastrophe. If people know that releasing a system will cause a catastrophe they don't want to occur, then they will presumably not release it. Or even if their level of worry that this risk could be real, if they think there's a 90% chance, the higher level of concern is, the less likely you are to deploy something that actually is dangerous. And there's a couple of basically areas of progress that could feed in to the ability to assess risk in this way. The first could be dangerous capability evaluations, technical and institutional evaluation methods that allow you to identify if a system has dangerous capabilities. And then also alignment evaluations or technical or institutional methods of identifying whether a system has a propensity to use these very dangerous capabilities. And these are both active areas of technical research at the moment, especially dangerous capability evaluations in the past year. One can imagine, though, eventually quite a lot of progress happening. Another thing that can make a difference in an increasing level of security is a general understanding of AI risk, even if people don't necessarily have great evaluations, or in addition to having evaluations, people may just sort of generally not underappreciate the level of risk that these systems pose in general. They may also be able to identify that certain development approaches are just likely by default to produce catastrophically dangerous systems and know, oh, if you're going to develop it in that way, it's very likely going to be unsafe. And then lastly, people may actually work out and identify reliably safe approaches to developing AI systems. They may identify some approaches where they know, if I follow this approach, it will produce a system that actually will be safe. And if you think again to this sort of toy AI Corp example, I think it's quite clear how each of these things could conceivably have prevented that scenario from occurring, especially if you crank up these knobs very high. If the company had two ways of making the systems, one they know for sure will produce extremely dangerous systems, one that they know will very likely produce safe systems, and also they can figure out if they've accidentally created a dangerous system. It's pretty clear how that reduces risk. Next category is better defenses. So obviously the story here is these systems have these dangerous capabilities, and then they use them and they cause catastrophes. And obviously the ability to cause a catastrophe depends not just on what specific abilities that you have, but also what defenses exist against those abilities. So if, for example, you have some tool that helps you conduct cyber attacks, it obviously matters what sorts of tools exist for defending against cyber attacks or preventing them. Or for manipulation, what sorts of tools exist to avoid manipulation, or you can just imagine in general, if there's good advice that people can get about how to navigate situations that have emerged. One can pretty easily imagine AI systems being very useful for producing a wide range of defenses. Potentially defenses against specific capabilities. You could also imagine, for example, simply asking, let's say GPT-7, hey, this situation is sort of getting out of hand, any good advice about how to handle this rogue system? Better monitoring is something that could help as well. So part of the concern in this Tory AI Corp scenario was that people don't notice that the system is misbehaving until, in some sense, it's too late. If it's possible to notice early signs of misbehavior or early misbehavior more quickly, then presumably it increases the chance of stamping it out before things are too late. And one could also very easily imagine that AI systems could be very useful for monitoring the behavior of other AI systems and classifying early warning signs. And then lastly, you can imagine, just in general, there might be better shutdown methods. So part of the scenario, again, was that perhaps people notice that something's going wrong, but for some reason they struggle to shut the system down because it can copy itself, or perhaps because it can make certain threats. You can imagine this being also general progress in shutting AI systems down. For example, on-chip mechanisms that allow people to remotely shut down chips anywhere in the world flexibly, something like that. You can imagine different tools that can make this part of the problem less bad. Okay, so finally, there's this broad category of constraints, ways in which actors could be constrained from making dangerous systems, even if for some reason they wanted to. First, you can imagine at a high level mandated best practices. You can imagine at a national level, governments only allow AI systems, at least in some high-risk category, to be developed if certain best practices are followed. For example, if the reliably safe training approaches are implemented, or if people actually implement these reliably useful evaluation methods. There's lots of different ways you can imagine it's being implemented, but like a pretty high-level one is you can imagine it's being done through a licensing regime, which release a system, you need to get licensed, and to get a license, you need to demonstrate that you've used safe methods and applied evaluations. Or perhaps you're licensed to use hardware or have access to hardware, or lots of other parts of the process that can lead to unsafe systems. Pretty relatedly, you can imagine a type of constraint that could be useful is emergency orders, the ability for government actors to just sort of flexibly tell developers not to develop or use or share certain systems if they become concerned. If there are warning shots or early signs of danger, just the ability to tell a developer, hey, you can't release that, is not a type of legal or practical authority that really exists at the moment, but conceivably could in the future. Non-proliferation is something that could conceivably be very useful, just very broadly. This means making it difficult for actors to gain access to the sorts of inputs that they need to develop AI systems, most notably computer hardware, most likely. And that could be implemented at a national level or also potentially through international non-proliferation regimes or export controls. Maybe not that disanalogous to some of the export controls that, for example, the US is beginning to place on China with regard to hardware. And then finally, there could be other international constraints that states place on one another that essentially pressure states to fall in line with other states when it comes to best practices or to non-proliferation regimes. And you can imagine a range of approaches there, ranging from agreements with robust monitoring and evaluation to credible sticks and carrots, conceivably even including threat of military force in the most extreme case, or potentially even more direct means of enforcing compliance. You can imagine, for example, hardware with mechanisms on it such that it automatically shuts down if an agreement has been violated. Very conceivably, AI could ultimately enable innovation in terms of enforcing international agreements. For example, one barrier to international agreements and monitoring regimes is typically that it's hard to trust that a human inspector won't gain access to private sensitive information and then share it back with the country that they're coming from. Whereas that concern doesn't necessarily exist for AI inspectors, who could conceivably be designed in such a way that they don't leak information. So there's a range of ways you can imagine AI helping with each of these things. Ultimately, it's pretty unclear how much protection will ultimately be needed. It's also really complicated to say something firm about this because there's a lot of different forms of protection one could have, and they substitute to some extent. So if you crank the knob up high enough on better safety knowledge and better defenses, such that you really need to be unimaginably negligent to accidentally create a catastrophic system, and then also it's just quite feasible to defend against the dangerous capabilities of catastrophically dangerous systems, if they're created, then you maybe don't even really need, in the long run, significant constraints. Those can actually substitute, and then vice versa. It could be the case that if other constraints or other protections are ramped up far enough, that this reduces the need for the first two. Ultimately, it's possible that we don't need very strong constraints, in which case we're in something like the bumper world. Or it could be the case that we need quite strong constraints, in which case we're in the sort of waterfall world where doom is almost inevitable, just because it's something that just is not realistic to impose. And an example of that could be if it's the case that the only way we emerge through the situation safely is with a robust, strongly empowered world government with a monopoly in force, like Bertrand Russell thought we might need in the Cold War. If we need that, then probably there's not a lot of reason to be optimistic. So ultimately, it makes the most sense to pay attention to the class of worlds where the protections we need in the long run are non-trivial, but still plausible. They're things that you can actually imagine getting implemented. Okay, last stretch now. So here's another approach to thinking kind of graphically about the likelihood in the long run of us ultimately crossing this rope. I actually drew this diagram myself in the good old-fashioned human way. I don't think AI systems can actually yet do so good of a job. Ultimately, if we're in this rope scenario, then the situation is such that the risk of catastrophe may go up at some point, and then ultimately it needs to converge back down, back towards zero. And ultimately, the objective that we should have is to compress that curve, to lower the peak, to make the peak less high, and also to push the risk back down more quickly, to make that sort of right-hand curve a bit more steep. And there's a few different ways you can sort of think about what it looks like to compress that curve. Partly, this is shrinking the gap between the point where the risk emerges and the point where sufficient protections are established, basically the point between when we step onto the rope and when we step off. But many protections can also help compress the curve, even if they're far from sufficient to eliminate the risk. There are a lot of protections that, even if they're not going to get you back down to zero, could still play a role in making the level of risk at any given point less high. So for example, maybe safety standards without monitoring and enforcement just aren't at all sufficient, but it could be the case that they help and make the risk of disaster lower in, let's say, the AI Corp case. Liability law, probably not going to be sufficient, but you could imagine just companies in general being concerned about being sued if their systems cause harm. Could have an effect on their level of caution or the level of seriousness with which they take building up internal processes and evaluations. Just somewhat better AI risk arguments could play a role. Just people thinking that the risk is a bit higher than they think it currently is something that presumably lowers the risk of a catastrophic deployment happening. Voluntary moratoriums, evals which don't capture everything but capture some things. There's lots of different things which can have a protective force to them and aren't going to solve the problem, but could make the curve less steep. There's also a lot of other factors that could impact the height of the curve or how quickly it declines, more or less indirectly. A really broad one is just the general competence and responsibleness of leading institutions that probably a lot of catastrophe stories, in line with actually many real-world catastrophes that have happened, probably have a significant element of incompetence involved in them. or just indifference, and simply having institutions have a generally higher level of competence to make and implement good decisions and a greater social concern is probably something that's risk reducing. Also the level of competitive pressure felt. So for example, if the United States feels that certain regulations would slow down progress, and it's worried about, let's say, the concern that China will not implement those protections, won't catch up, presumably that makes it harder for regulations to be implemented, similar for labs being responsible if they fear that they're going to lose market share. So even if just lowering competitive pressure in these ways is not going to completely solve the issue, obviously it affects the risk factor. Just to sketch quickly some broad high-level ways that interventions can lower total risk. They can shorten the path to useful protections being implemented if ultimately the need for them becomes clear. And there's a range of things here, so that can be, for example, working on developing dangerous capability and misalignment evals and trying to seed progress there. If you think that ultimately we might need a regulatory regime that enforces best practices, actually working out those best practices and trying to get convergence between labs is something that could help with that. Sort of pushing memes, sort of pushing the idea that certain things might be necessary in the future and sort of normalizing them and shifting the Overton window. Developing sketches of policy proposals, which it's not possible to actually implement now, but some version of them conceivably could be implemented in the future. Lots of different things that you can do that might in some way shorten that path to useful protections being put in place. You could also conceivably do things that buy time until the emergence of catastrophic safety risk, basically give more time for protections to be put in place or just capacity to be built up. And there's a range of different ways that could conceivably happen. Lowering competitive pressures during a future period of risk, making it so that in expectation, whatever the leading actor is less worried about what happens if they fall behind, is something that could be useful, and that might actually involve, for example, making sure that whatever the leading actors are feel like they have breathing room. And then lastly, increasing the general capacity of institutions to make wise decisions. So probably a lot is just going to depend on how ready different institutions with a lot of power are going to be to actually implement policies that are good, make wise, responsible decisions at a high level and lots of granular levels. And there's probably lots of different things you can do there, from supporting talent pipelines, trying to get good, effective, competent, risk-concerned people to work in these places, to providing them with access to networks of experts, to trying to help them formulate better internal decision-making processes, and lots of other things like that. So that's a very broad, high-level sketch of different things that might help. Just to sum up this relatively long talk, here's some key points. First, we could conceivably be in a tightrope scenario when it comes to catastrophic safety risk from AI. It could be the case that there is a meaningful risk here, and a meaningful chance a catastrophe will occur, but also a contingency in the outcome, such that our actions can make a difference. This kind of tightrope scenario deserves special attention, even if its probability is not necessarily that high. We can also paint a rough picture of the kinds of protections, especially in the categories of knowledge, defenses, and constraints, that might allow us to ultimately step back down on the solid ground and get the risk back down low. It may be possible to reduce this risk through interventions that shorten the path to having useful protections in place. It also may be possible to reduce the risk through interventions that do a range of other things, though, including buying time, reducing future competitive pressures, and also increasing general institutional competence and preparedness. So my hope is ultimately that we are in the first world with the little girl pushing the bowling ball down the alleyway with the bumpers. That's my hope. It may turn out to be the case that we're instead in this world, where there's a meaningful risk of falling down and a meaningful risk that we will fail and catastrophe will occur. But even if we are in this scenario, there's at least a hopeful thought that there are actions we can do to prepare for that moment when we may have to step out on the rope. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Just as a reminder, if you submit your questions on the Swap Card app, I'll get them here, and vote on your favorites because we won't be able to get to all of them. Thanks, Ben.
Absolutely.
So to start us off, there's a question from Peter here, and it's that some have argued that for AI to actually pose an existential risk or catastrophic risk, advanced robotics capabilities will be necessary. So this may be reassuring, as it seems that significant robotics capabilities lag other AI progress. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I would certainly think that the more capabilities a system has, the greater its potential for damage would be. I do think you can at least paint toy scenarios where robotics is not necessary. So for example, although I don't know this is necessarily terribly likely, you can, for example, paint a toy scenario where an AI system can help cause biological weapons to be synthesized, for example, through giving advice or encouragement to people who have, let's say, destructive impulses. So at least you can tell toy scenarios where it's not necessary. And it really depends, again, what your threshold here. If it's a global catastrophe versus something that, let's say, kills everyone, obviously the level of capability you need is much higher. So yeah, I suppose that's the thought here. There's also actually another class of, another factor here that people sometimes keep in mind is there's some stories you can tell about why an AI system might cause a catastrophe. And some of these misalignment concerns have a flavor of a system has some long-term goals and it's causing a catastrophe because it wants to prevent people from interfering with its pursuit of its long-term goals because it's concerned people might in some way shut it down or things like that. And then one interesting dynamic here is even if you have that kind of AI system, there's an incentive not to just basically blow up the world, because if you don't have the ability to maintain all of the critical infrastructure that allows AI systems to run, like power plants or building new fabs or things like that, then it doesn't even further that kind of misaligned goal. So it's actually also one kind of potentially sort of strange way in which robotics could also be a bottleneck to certain classes of concerns.
Thank you. So there are two that are kind of neck and neck for the top desired questions. I'm just going to skip to the second one first. In this talk, you didn't say anything concrete about how likely you actually think we are to be in the different scenarios. Are you happy to comment on what your personal views are?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this depends a little bit what threshold we're drawing here. If we're talking about full-on existential catastrophes or things to the level of human extinction, then most of my weight is actually on, fortunately, the bumper scenario, essentially. I do actually think probably it's not terribly likely that catastrophes will occur which are unintended and so terrible at the level of, let's say, human extinction. If you set the threshold lower to just lower levels of catastrophe, then it starts to become much more plausible to me. But it's not negligible. I sometimes give people numbers at the level of low single digits, or sometimes it dips below 1%, and I don't really know where it settles. When it comes to the possibility that risk is real, I guess there's a relative likelihood that it's something we can do something about versus it's just out of control. I guess I would tend to give a bit more weight to it being something which is contingent, just in part because I think if you lean on the more optimistic end of the spectrum, then that sort of left half or something of your weight in that tips towards the one where we just barely fail or things just barely get out of hand.
Great answer. I really like this question. This is actually touching on Bing Chat to bring back to a very popular example. So Lizzie would like to get your view on how misaligned Bing Chat really is. So just because it parrots the words, "I can hack you, I can ruin you," does that mean it understands what those words mean and could actively pursue those actions? Again, as you mentioned, these things how you answer this question today may be very different than you answer it in 2 months from now. But, or is just parroting some movie script with those words, is it doing that, but has no knowledge of what they mean? Saying it and doing it feels like a large AI development gap.
Yeah, so I definitely think that Bing Chat cannot ruin you, basically. I think the things that Bing Chat is threatening to do, it cannot do. It just can't, and it's not extremely close to being able to do them. Yeah, I do also think as well, like I sort of intentionally use a somewhat, let's say, less theoretically thick definition of alignment, which is just a propensity to use capabilities that people don't want them to use. And so in this case, you could say Bing Chat has the capability to make threats to people, or say threatening things, and people don't want it to be doing that, but it is. So in that sense, Bing Chat just is misaligned in that definition. There's a thicker notion you might have of misalignment, that the system, in some sense, has goals, and those goals are goals which are really in tension with the sorts of things that people want, like it actually wants, in some meaningful sense, to cause harm. I think that's much harder to say because it's not really clear what it means to have goals. This isn't really a theoretically or defined concept in computer science or philosophy. There's really thin notions of it you could use where, okay, it's probably fair to say that Bing Chat has goals. There's relatively thick versions of it you could use where probably it isn't fair to say it has goals, and it's not really clear. It's not really clear what it means. It's also not really clear how we would identify whether systems have this. And I do think as well, like in terms of the overall, I think there's this overall question of how predictive is the concern that appeared with Bing Chat. And I also think it's completely possible that it's not that predictive or that telling about what sort of risks might emerge in the future. It's a little bit hard to say because we don't know exactly how the system was developed. But yeah, one hypothesis is some of what's going on with it is in the data that's absorbed from the internet, there's examples of AI systems just making threats or saying Skynet type things. And the system is copying those behaviors because it's just sort of doing this mimicry thing. And if that's all that's going on here, then you might think, okay, this will probably be resolved, or could be potentially resolved just through sort of nudging it away from that sort of thing. And it doesn't really have that strong of an implication for this question of whether deceptive alignment is a major concern, whether you get the dog that jumps up on the couch all the time or doesn't. So yeah, long-winded way of saying, I do think Bing Chat currently is not really dangerous. And then it is certainly probably the case that the way in which it's misaligned is notably different than the sorts of misalignment concerns that people have in the future.
That is all we have time for, and actually a really nice note to end on, actually. Please join me in thanking Ben for his time. And and also join us in the office hours because I'm sure that there will be lots to discuss. Thank you for your questions here, and we look forward to answering them there.
Well, thanks so much, Roman.
Thanks.